One of the fun things about going away on holiday, especially if you go to another country, is that you can try different food. Food that you wouldn't normally get. Food that is completely kind of out of your normal range of taste and experience. And it's particularly helpful if you get a Wi-Fi signal so you can use Google Translate, because if the menu isn't in English, it can be a little bit of an exercise of, well, let's see what that is. If there aren't pictures on the menu, then again, it can be like, well, I'm not sure what this means, but let's try this. So anyway, we were in Spain over the summer, and we had some big hits in terms of meals out, and we had some big misses as well. The biggest miss was this. It tasted a little bit vegetable-like, and so our best guess was that it was probably like artichoke or something like that, but we gave up on it eventually because it just didn't leave a good taste in your mouth afterwards. And then I asked the waitress what it was, and then with the help of Google Translate, found out that it's actually lamb intestines wound around a stick and then stuck on a barbecue. And so that was the biggest miss. For me, the biggest hits, this was like an almond gazpacho, and that was absolutely stunning. It was completely unexpected in terms of flavor, but that was great. And then this was also a big hit for me. So that is a yogurt ice cream with a white chocolate sauce, a little bit of lime zest and some raspberry. That was divine. And so anyway, Jesus apparently had a real enjoyment of food as well. In fact, from people that were detractors of his, he had a reputation for being a glutton and a drunkard because he was so often spotted eating out with people. And but you see, the thing about Jesus is that the food that most excited him is probably something that we wouldn't really think of in terms of food. See, for Jesus, he described the scriptures as being food. He said, man cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And so in Jesus' thinking, in his understanding, this was food. It was something he couldn't live without. This was what gave him life. And in another place, Jesus says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. So it wasn't just that the scriptures were food. It was actually doing what the scriptures said. It was doing God's will. It was putting this into practice in some way that energized him, that motivated him, that gave him this kind of release of life on the inside. And Jesus' disciples noticed that. They noticed that he devoted himself to scriptures just like we devote ourselves to eating. You know, we have to eat regularly every day to be healthy and to have life. Well, Jesus had that same kind of relationship with the scriptures. And the disciples clocked that. And they noticed that he didn't just read this, he didn't just memorize it, he actually did what it said. And so they also copied him. They became devoted to the scriptures, and they discovered that there's something in these words that is like daily bread. There's something in here that you need to live, just like you need food every day to live. Without it, you will start to die. And there's something that happens when you take what is in here and you start to live it out that releases a life and energy inside of you that you would receive in no other way. And so, because we're on a journey of being disciples, we are spending time actually devoting ourselves to the scriptures by looking at the gospel according to John. And John was an eyewitness of Jesus' life. He was Jesus' closest and longest serving disciple. So he's like a really good person for us to look to and go to if we want to learn to be disciples of Jesus. And more than that, John was a disciple of Jesus over the long term. He didn't follow Jesus for a season and then drift. He didn't follow Jesus for a season and then drop out. He followed Jesus year in and year out. When it was hard, when it was bad, when it was good, when things were going well, when things were not going well. He followed Jesus until the end of his days. And so my prayer, my hope is that as we allow John to speak to us, as we allow the scriptures to get into us, my prayer is that in some way, a little bit of him will rub off on us. And and that because he was following Jesus, a little bit of Jesus that John picked up on would rub off on us, and because the words that he wrote are scripture, because they're inspired by the Holy Spirit, God's word will get inside of us, and we would experience a release of life because his word is in us. So that's my prayer. So we've been looking at John's Gospel. We're going to pick up today where we left off a couple of weeks ago. We're in John chapter 2, if you want to follow along. And I've asked Mike to read for us from 13 through to 25. Thank you.
Not long before the Jewish festival of Passover, Jesus went to Jerusalem. There he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves in the temple. He also saw money changers sitting at their tables. So he took some rope, made a whip. Then he chased everyone out of the temple, together with their sheep and cattle. He turned over the tables of the money changers and scattered their coins. Jesus said to the people who had been selling doves, "Get those doves out of here. Don't make my Father's house a marketplace." The disciples then remembered that the scriptures say, "My love for your house burns in me like a fire." The Jewish leaders asked Jesus, "What miracle will you perform to show us why you have done this?" "Destroy the temple," Jesus answered, "and in 3 days I will build it again." The leaders replied, "It took 46 years to build this temple. What makes you think you can rebuild it in 3 days?" But Jesus was talking about his body as a temple. And when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had told them. Then they believed the scriptures and the words of Jesus. In Jerusalem, during the Passover, many people put their faith in Jesus because they saw him perform miracles. But Jesus knew that was what was in their hearts, and he would not let them have power over him. No one had to tell him what the people were like. He already knew.
So, Jesus says that this is food. Now, there's so much here that it's like a menu that you can't, there's too much to choose from. So you're not going to be able to eat everything that is on the menu. And so I'm going to pick a couple of things that I hope together will make a full meal. All right, but if you want to come back to this passage, you will find that there's more here than what I've just picked. In fact, there's a lot more here. So, let's start with tapas. Tapas is like the nibbles before you have the starter. Okay, so tapas. The story before this one that Mike has just read for us, Jesus was in a village called Cana. And there he went to a wedding and he he turned water into a huge amount of wine. So that was the story right before this. Now, if you were here a couple of weeks ago, I told you that the name Cana means zeal. And so there's a really strong argument that this village was a zealot stronghold. It was a zealot community. The zealots they were radical extremists. They believed that a militant resistance to Roman rule was what honored God most of all. And so they were active in their resistance to Rome. The Romans would have called them terrorists. So Jesus went into this terrorist village and he celebrated a wedding with them. The next story that John tells us, the next account from the life of Jesus, we find Jesus in the temple. This is the most sacred site, religious site, in the known world at the time. And Jesus single-handedly in that temple causes a public disturbance. And why would he do that? Well, John tells us he did it because zeal, or in Mike's translation, this passionate love, this fiery love for God, kind of consumed him on the inside. So we have the same word, Cana. So Jesus went to a village called Cana, a village called Zeal, a place where there were lots of people that were full of passion. And then in the next story, Jesus, full of Cana, full of passion, does this act in the temple. Of all the stories that John could have picked to include, of all the stories he could have started his gospel off with, he chose these two and he put them right next to each other. John's point and Jesus' point is, if you're going to have passion in life, if you're going to live with zeal for anything, make sure that you don't put your zeal in the wrong place. Don't misplace your zeal. Don't put your passion into something that is not of God. If you have passion inside of you, if you're going to spend it anywhere, spend it on God, on His agenda, on His kingdom, on His values, on His priorities. Because if you misspend your passion, you will lose it. See, the truth is, this isn't it. And so when you spend your passion on this, you actually lose the passion that you have forever. It's gone, it's lost. But if you spend your passion on God, it will bear fruit forever. And so this is the example that Jesus set to his disciples. What he was passionate about was God. It was about God's house. It was about worship of God. Just let that sink in for a minute. Tapas. Primeros. The starter. So, after this disturbance in the temple, the religious leaders come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, what authority do you have to have just done this? I mean, if you really are sent from God, then prove it. We want to see a miracle. We want to see a sign. We want to see evidence that you have God's seal of approval. Now, that attitude isn't really a long way away from the way that many of us think in our own heart. See, those Jewish religious leaders saw themselves as being able to stand in judgment over Jesus. That Jesus needed their approval. He needed their authentication. And sometimes we have that same attitude too. That we stand in judgment over Jesus. Jesus, you have to prove yourself to me. You have to demonstrate that you are worthy of my commitment. You have to demonstrate that you're worthy of my love. If you want all of my life, you have to show me that you're worth me giving all my life for. And if you can't convince me, then I reserve the right to opt out of who you call me to be. I reserve the right to ignore some of your directions. I reserve the right to rule my own life. Now, listen, you need to understand this. Jesus is a king. And kings are not voted into power. Kings become kings by right. You need to understand that who Jesus is by right. He is the King of Kings. He didn't rise up through the ranks to become King of Kings. There was no vote to elect him King of Kings. He is King of Kings because he is the creator of all things and he is the owner of all things and he sustains all things. If Jesus didn't sustain us in this moment, we would instantly cease to exist. We exist every moment of our lives because he chooses us. And what around us exists is because he chooses creation. He is the sustainer of everything. Jesus is king by right. He has all the power and all the authority in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. He is king by right. Everything has been placed under his feet. He has a name that is higher than every name. So Jesus doesn't need your vote. He doesn't need your support. He isn't begging you to, in some way, cheer him on. As King of Kings and as Lord of Lords, he invites you to be part of his family. That is the greatest honor that anyone will ever be able to extend to you. And so we need to stand down from thinking that we have to endorse Jesus. We get to stand in judgment over him. The good news, the gospel is that Jesus is a good king. He's a good king. And so we can trust him with our lives because he's a king that rules with the interests of his people at heart. He's not ruling for his own benefit and his own gain. He's ruling in a way to express and demonstrate his faithfulness and his unfailing love towards us. Everything that he does is for our good. And so you can entrust your life to him, knowing that that is a great decision to live going forwards. And if, for whatever reason, you still feel like you need some kind of endorsement of Jesus, the truth is that God has endorsed him. The fact that Jesus performed miracles is God's endorsement of him. It's God's way of saying, this is my chosen king. The fact that he was raised from the dead is God's public approval of Jesus, that God endorses his life. Segundo, this is the main course. In Spain, it's tapas, primeros, segundo, main course. So in the 2nd century BC, so this is 200 years before Jesus, a king called Antiochus Epiphanes, a Greek king, conquered Jerusalem. And as his armies came into the city, he decided to desecrate the temple. That means he made the temple unclean. What did he do? He sacrificed pigs on the altar, the place where people had worshipped God for generations. And then he brought idols into the temple and he banned worship of God in the temple precincts. So you could only go to the temple to worship idols. And so having conquered the city, or having been conquered, the Jewish people immediately rebelled against his rule because of these choices that he'd made around the temple. And the Jewish people managed to galvanize themselves, and they overthrew the authorities that Antiochus had put in place in Jerusalem. They regained their political freedom. And as part of that process, they reconsecrated the temple. They cleaned out all of that rubbish. And they once again started worship of the one true God in the temple. They still, Jewish people to this day, celebrate that reconsecration. It's called Hanukkah. They celebrate the moment that as a people, they triumphed over oppression. And as a people, they brought themselves back into alignment with God. And they brought their worship back into the place where God said, worship me here. So what Jesus did in the temple on that day was a shocking thing to the Jewish people. Because Jesus was reconsecrating the temple. But this time, the people that had to be cleaned out of the temple were the very people who thought of themselves as worshippers of God. And the truth is that actually, we're not that far from them ourselves. See, they objected to pigs being sacrificed on the altar. But they were quite happy for the area that was reserved for worship to become a marketplace where people could come and buy their animals for sacrifice. It didn't bother them that that might interfere with people's worship or distract their worship of God. They were really offended at having idols in the temple, but it was okay with them for the priest to use this little exit out of the temple precincts that went outside the city as a tax avoidance of the Roman customs officials on the main gates of the city. And so what would happen is that money would change hands and merchants would come in through that little gate and they would traipse right across the temple worship courts and slip into the city and avoid paying tax. And they were good with that. And the truth is that in many ways we're like them. That we like to call other people out on their sin. And we big up the sins of other people. But we like to gloss over our own. We like to turn a blind eye to our own sin. We have different standards for other people and for ourselves. And when other people fall short of the standard that we set for them, we make sure that they know about that. And we tell other people about it. When we fall short of our own standard, we just move on as fast as possible. And what we need to understand is that our God is holy. And that sin is sin. I mean, sin is a seed. So there's no such thing as big sins and little sins. If you have an apple seed and you let it start to grow, you get an apple tree. It might only be that big, but that is an apple tree. If you leave it, it will become this big. No apples on it yet, but that is an apple tree. And that's why Jesus says, guys, listen, you need to understand when you get angry, if you don't deal with that anger, that is sin. And that is the same as being murder. Because that seed of anger puts you on a one-way street. And where it ends up, the fruit of that sin is murder. So anger is murder. And a little apple tree is going to give you apples. Jesus says, lust is adultery. It doesn't matter if you only lust occasionally. It means you're on that road. That's where the fruit is going to end up. Sin is sin. And let me just throw in an observation here, because this is really important we get this. And this is something right out of the Bible, but I see it. When we accommodate sin in our own lives, when we choose to turn a blind eye to our own sin, it grows. But it also gets passed on to our kids. And the thing is that our kids get the growth of our own sin. They get what we ignored with interest. So if you persist in anger and you don't challenge it and you sweep it under the carpet, it will grow and your kids get the bigger tree. So now they have to start working harder than you did because they get the growth because you didn't confront it. And that's why we keep going on about, guys, deal with the wounds in your life. Deal with the stuff. You've got to forgive. Don't leave stuff unresolved. You can't afford to do it. Because it doesn't just affect you, it's going to spill into the lives of others. That's why we have Emmanuel Prayer. Because it deals with wounds and it deals with sin. This is so important. Prostrate, dessert. So, John tells us in this passage that while Jesus was at this festival, he performed many miraculous signs. Right there, the last paragraph. Many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. Isn't that incredible that the religious authorities demanded Jesus perform a sign? And John says he was at the festival performing signs and miracles all week. But that obviously wasn't enough for them. But anyway, so Jesus was performing all of these signs, and it says, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them. If you read it in the New King James Version, it says many people believed in Jesus because of the signs he was performing. But Jesus did not commit himself to them. Now this should make you sit up. Because for years the church has told people, all you have to do is believe in Jesus. And yet John is telling us here that people believed in Jesus, but Jesus didn't commit himself to them. Jesus did not commit himself to believers. That's awkward. Why not? Because Jesus wants something more than belief. He's looking for something more than a believer. See, you can believe in Jesus, but that can lead to very little substance in your life. Yeah, I believe in him. I prayed a prayer. I believe that he's forgiven my sin. Past, present, future. So I believe I'm going to heaven. It's all good. And that can be the sum total of the substance of our faith. Jesus isn't looking for people like that. And this is what we keep talking about. What he's looking for is disciples. He's looking for people who are going to take that belief and work it into their lives and allow it to change everything about the way that they live. He's looking for people who don't just believe in him, but people who want to do life with him. He's looking for people who are willing to surrender the whole of their lives to him without exception, no matter what the cost. That's who Jesus will commit himself to. So, this one account from the life of Jesus. And in that account is the gospel. Jesus says, guys, don't misplace your passion. Don't even spread your passion out between lots of different things, because if you do that, you won't be able to give God all of your heart, because you'd have given a bit of your heart here and a bit there and a bit over there. If you're going to live with passion, put it all in one place. Jesus calls us to accept him as king. Not as your mate, not as your personal assistant. He's the king. And Jesus calls us to address the rebellion against God that's in our hearts, not to gloss over it. And he calls us to do more than believe. That's the invitation of Jesus. That's the gospel. That those who disciple themselves to Jesus will be adopted into God's family as children.